there was ever a band that deserved far more recognition than they received, and they received quite a bit, it'd be Concrete Blonde. They were one of those rare groups that could sound beautiful and aggressive at the same time, and sometimes vulnerable, which comes in later, maybe mysterious as well, all within the same song sometimes. While many people remember them for one unforgettable hit, Joey, and we'll get to that, longtime fans know that the band's catalog runs much deeper than a single radio staple, which is still here from time to time today. The music blended alternative rock, post-punk, gothic imagery, definitely at one point, heartfelt songwriting, and into something completely unique, which I really liked about them. They weren't one of my favorites, but they were up there for a little bit. Fronted by one of the most distinctive voices in rock history, Johnette Napolitano, Concrete Blonde created songs that were equal parts poetry and confession, and sometimes a little more. They weren't chasing trends, really. They weren't trying to become pop stars. I mean, their one big hit was actually unlikely. They simply wrote honest music. And because of that, the songs have aged pretty well, I would say. Most of it. First album, maybe production-wise, not so much, but the songs were there. To understand where Concrete Blonde came from, we have to go back again to Los Angeles in the early 1980s. This wasn't the glamorous Los Angeles of movie stars and sunshine and Sunset Strip. This was a city full of struggling musicians and smoky clubs, right? And countless bands trying to make their mark. I think that's when Lone Justice was around that time. Punk had exploded just a few years earlier, and its influence could still be kind of felt throughout the music scene. New Wave was becoming increasingly popular and kind of on top for a long while college rock was just beginning to carve out its own identity, and it was still coming from the East. It still hadn't reached the West at this point. Now, somewhere in the middle of all that emerged a trio that didn't really fit into one category, and that's we discussed this before. That's always kind of a tell. The band originally formed under the name Dream Six. Bassist and singer Johnette Napolitano, it teamed up with guitarist James Mankey. And before too long, they were playing clubs throughout Southern California. Napolitano wasn't your typical front woman. Her voice wasn't polished or delicate. It carried an incredible weight that could go from a whisper to a scream without ever sounding forced in either direction. She wrote songs that dealt with heartbreak, addiction, sometimes religious, sometimes takes like that, and redemption long before those themes became fashionable in alternative music. And remember, they were kind of before alternative music. James Mankey provided the perfect musical counterpart. His guitar playing was melodic without being flashy, without being self-indulgent or anything like that. And he was capable of shifting from, gentle acoustic stuff to walls of distorted sound sometimes in kind of in an instant, at least from song to song. The pair quickly developed a reputation around LA for writing good songs that stood out from everybody else and just being good on stage. And while glam metal was still dominating Sunset Strip, Dream Six wasn't interested in hairspray or leather pants. And one of the most interesting stories about the band involves how they got their now famous name. Now, while they were signed to IRS Records, the label home to artists like REM and the Go-Go's, the band was encouraged to find something more memorable than Dream Six, okay? And according to one of the most widely repeated stories, if true, REM frontman Michael Stipe looked at Johnette Napolitano, noticed her blonde hair, combined with the gritty urban atmosphere, apparently, and suggested Concrete Blonde. I don't know if that's true or if just, been polished over. I heard he also offered them the name Hetch Hetchy, so who knows. With the newly renamed Concrete Blonde, they signed with IRS Records, a label that had become one of the premier homes for alternative rock music during the 80s. Unlike the major labels chasing arena rock, IRS specialized in artists who didn't necessarily fit, like the Go-Go's or the Police and, REM later. That made it an ideal home for Concrete Blonde. The label already had credibility thanks to REM. Fine Young Cannibals were with them, Wall of Voodoo, and several other college radio favorites. Being surrounded by these artists gave Concrete Blonde an opportunity to reach listeners who were actively searching for music outside the mainstream. That kind of gave them a little bit of a head start there. Their self-titled debut album arrived in 1986, and for some reason I thought it was later than that, but once I looked back at when I got the cassette, that seems about right, 86. And it immediately demonstrated that this wasn't going to be an ordinary rock band. Critics praised her voice and her songwriting and the vocal performance, while noting the band's ability to combine punk energy with sophisticated lyrics. Songs like Still in Hollywood, that one kicks ass today. It painted vivid pictures of chasing dreams in Los Angeles while confronting disappointment and loneliness. It's a rowdy song, but there is a little, at least cynicism behind it. Let's put it that way. It became one of the band's earliest signature songs and remains a fan favorite today. I think my favorite on that album was True, but that's the one that I first heard probably on 120 minutes. And that's the one that I think the production suffers, although the song is still great. Napolitano's lyrics are intensely personal without becoming self-indulgent. Menke's guitar work created enormous space around the song, and the rhythm section, it was tight, it was okay, it was understated, but it allowed the songs to kind of be the songs rather than overwhelming them. So commercially, the success came pretty slowly. Like I said, True was, I think, the first single. If they'd have released Still in Hollywood as the kicker at the beginning, that'd have been something else. But one reason might have just been timing. Like always, the late 80s were crowded with musical movements competing for attention, glam metal, Poison, and all that. They were on MTV big time. Pop stars ruled the charts as well. College rock was still considered outside of the boundaries of what the radio was willing to play. So Concrete Blonde occupied a strange middle ground that didn't fit any, marketing department's expectations. They weren't going to take that on because it's a heavier lift. They were kind of too intelligent for pop radio, not to sound, too crass, but too melodic for hardcore punk, and they were too dark for mainstream rock. So, and maybe too emotional to fit into any single genre. Ironically, those very qualities are exactly why their music continues, I think, today. The band's second album, Free, arrived in 1989 and represented another important step forward. The songwriting was stronger. The band sounded more like a band this time. While they didn't immediately produce massive commercial success, many longtime fans consider Free to be one of the hidden gems, and I'm in that category. The songs explored themes of freedom, obviously, broken relationships, and self-discovery. Napolitano's writing had matured considerably, revealing an artist becoming more comfortable exposing her vulnerabilities throughout her songwriting, which I think is pretty good. One original standout track from Free, and probably one of my favorites of their songs, is God as a Bullet. It's a song that demonstrated Concrete Blonde's willingness to tackle difficult subjects without offering any easy answers. It asks the questions and then walks away. The lyrics confronted violence, spirituality, and human emotions while maintaining enough ambiguity for listeners to draw their own conclusions. I love that. That approach became one of Napolitano's trademarks. Rather than preaching, she invited listeners to kind of, make up their own decisions about some of life's more difficult questions. That song kicks ass, though. Despite continued critical acclaim, the band still hadn't achieved the breakthrough that many believed they deserved. Yet something was changing beneath the surface. College radio stations were embracing their music. Alternative music audiences were steadily growing, and more importantly, Napolitano was becoming recognized as one of rock's truly exceptional vocalists. She possessed an extraordinary ability to communicate emotion, whether she was singing softly over an acoustic song or unleashing full-throated cries during the emotional climax of a song. All of it felt real. All of it felt authentic, and that's what I think a lot of us liked. But as the 80s came to a close, music itself was beginning to change. Americans were growing tired of polished arena rock, Journey and all that, and that was already kind of out the door. Tired of formulaic pop. Think George Michael, Madonna. We were just, some of us were sick of it. Alternative music was quietly building momentum across America. And Psych, REM, Pixies, Jane's Addiction, and Replacements. They were laying the groundwork for what would soon become a cultural shift without realizing it. Concrete Blonde was standing in exactly the right place at the right time. Their biggest album, and the song that would forever define them, was just around the corner. That breakthrough wouldn't produce simply a change in the band's career. It produced one of alternative rock's most haunting albums, introduced many listeners to Johnette Napolitano's unforgettable voice, and create a power ballad that remains one of the defining songs of the 1990s. But as often happens in the music business, success would arrive carrying both opportunity and unexpected challenges. So keep that in mind. Now, by the time the band entered the studio to record what would become Bloodletting, there was a sense that everything they had been building towards was finally beginning to come together. They had spent years honing their sound, sharpening their songwriting, developing a following on the college radio circuit and on the concert circuit. While they still weren't household names, they'd earned something that every great band hopes for. That's credibility. Fans trusted them. Critics respected them as well, I think, and fellow musicians kind of recognized that Concrete Blonde become one of alternative rock's best kept secret. They were big enough at the moment. But what they didn't know was that the next album would finally introduce them to the mainstream, even if it wasn't in the way that anyone expected. Released in 1990, Bloodletting was unlike almost anything else on the radio at the time. The album blended rock, a little blues, folk, gothic imagery out the ass, and country. Joey, if you listen to it, is basically a country song. Johnette Napolitano's songwriting, it reached a different level, and her lyrics became more like they were on screen. They were more confident and even more personal, while still, leaving enough room for listeners to kind of put themselves in it. The title itself hinted that this wasn't going to be a lighthearted record. Historically, bloodletting refers to an old medical practice in which doctors believe taking blood out you can bleed out the illness. They called it bleeding, of course. Of course, the album used the idea more symbolically. These songs were about emotional bloodletting, right? There was pain throughout the record. There was also hope. There was an album that acknowledged suffering without surrendering to it. And side note, chicks loved this album. Don't know why. It could be because of the vampire imagery, which we'd see later in the Twilight series. Chicks just love vampires for some reason. The opening song, Bloodletting, immediately established that album's unique personality. It's inspired in part by the growing popularity of vampire fiction at the time, the gothic atmosphere that surrounded alternative culture sometimes, in some spots anyways. And while the listeners may have heard nothing more than a clever vampire song, longtime fans recognized that Napolitano rarely wrote in literal terms. So I don't know if she was really talking about vampires, but she was kind of talking about vampires. As strong as the opening track was, it wasn't the song that would change everything. That honor belonged to Joey. And Joey is, to this day, a great song. I've always liked it, and I think I've loved it more and more over the years. If there's one thing that defines them for millions of listeners, it's this one. Released as a single from Bloodletting, Joey became the band's highest charting hit and introduced Johnette Napolitano's voice to an entirely new audience. This one was all over MTV at the time. And it's a great song. Suddenly, they're a band that had spent years slowly building to a point, and then this just put him in hyperdrive. It was really, really good and really, really big. What made Joey so powerful, though, was it sounded honest. I don't know if the song is a true story or anything, but it sounded that way. And rather than presenting a simple love song, she wrote about loving someone whose personal struggles threatened to consume both of them. I think I'll Stand By You by the Pretenders, kind of the same tone anyway, at least songwriting-wise. And that's another one that I really dig. Like many of her songs, though, Joey succeeds because it allows listeners to kind of bring their own selves into the story, which I love. Nearly everyone they've loved somebody that they couldn't save. We've all been around that. But that's the emotional core of Joey. Musically, the song demonstrates just how talented the band had become. James Mankey's understated guitar work, it was really, really good. Now Joey is not my favorite on the album. There's others that I think are better. I think Caroline was probably one of the best songs they've ever done, or anybody has ever done. That's a good song. But while Joey was climbing the charts, Bloodletting became just a breakthrough. The band had worked towards that for nearly a decade. Songs like, again, Caroline, Tomorrow, Wendy is really good. The Skies of a Poisonous Garden, that's one that I always remember when I go back to and listen to this album. One of the most powerful closing moments, I guess, came with Tomorrow, Wendy. That was written by Andy Preboy, and the song tells the story of a woman facing her final day of life. And I think, I was 20 years old when I got this, I guess, and I even knew right then that pretty sure that's what this song was about. Turns out that's what the song was about. It was during the height of the AIDS crisis, so the song kind of took on an additional meaning for a lot of people, becoming an anthem of grief and remembrance. It's just a great song, and the ending of it just kills me. But looking back, it's remarkable to see how fearless Bloodletting actually was. There's no way they could have thought this was going to be a huge hit, but it was a big one. But as successful as the album became, again, timing, it kind of placed the band at an interesting spot. It sold a lot. It did. But, Nirvana was just around the corner, and that was the tidal wave, the tsunami that took away everything and then just kind of wiped it clean. So, ironically, Concrete Blonde had already been making emotional, raw music for Nirvana and all that. But, they got They were the baby that got thrown out with the bathwater. That sometimes happens. But following the success of Bloodletting, most record labels would have encouraged their artists to make the exact same album. After all, Joey had become a genuine hit, but they weren't going to do that. That's not who they were. They had never written songs to satisfy record executives, and James Mankey wasn't interested in repeating guitar parts simply because it worked before. The next studio album, Walking in London, that came out in '92, and from the very first track, it's clear that this was not going to be Bloodletting Part 2. And kudos for them, because like Driving and Crying with Fly Me Courageous, they could have done just that, but they didn't. And I think that just makes their catalog richer. I do. But instead of chasing another Joey, the band expanded the musical palette even further. A little bit of blues, some jazz influences maybe. It was very much different. The arrangements were more adventurous, while Napolitano's lyrics grew even more introspective, which was interesting that one went one way and one went the other way. But, the title itself, it reflected change. London has long been associated with artistic reinvention, and in many ways, the album kind of represented that. One of the standout tracks, you gotta admit, was Ghost of a Texas Ladies Man. The title alone sounds like something lifted from a novel, and the song carried that same kind of quality. It was another reminder that Napolitano approached songwriting more like a storyteller than a traditional rock lyricist. She painted vivid pictures rather than relying on simple verse-chorus formulas, which that's cool. And there's Someday. Someday's a really good song, too. That one is, I think that one is produced perfectly like it should be as it sounds now. That's a good song. It often gets overlooked because at that time they were kind of on the downtrend. It was on MTV, but it didn't hit nearly as like Joey did. So, that's just how it works. But by 1992, the music industry completely different. It was consumed by Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots a little bit later, and I like STP, they were good. And dozens of other bands that dominated radio playlists and magazine covers and MTV eventually. Alternative music had become mainstream almost overnight, really. I think REM is the only one that made it out of the great college rock scare, but even they struggled a little bit with the alternative label. Concrete Blonde, they just didn't fit into that movement. They weren't from Seattle. They weren't particularly interested in distorted guitar riffs just because they didn't project the slacker image that some did. Instead, they continued making, their thoughtful music and sounds, and it owed just as much to folk and poetry as they did rock and punk. And I don't know how I feel about that, because I thought they should have made that leap. In hindsight, that's one of the things that makes their catalog age so gracefully, because while some albums are from the early 1990s, they sound trapped within a certain musical trend. Concrete Blondes kind of remained fluid and elastic, and that makes them fun. So 2 years later came Mexican Moon. I think this is the last one of theirs I had. I'm pretty sure it was the last one. The album embraced Southwestern influences, acoustic sounds and stuff, almost dreamlike atmosphere that perfectly complemented what Napolitano was writing about at the time. Title track immediately established the album's unique personality. It felt like less of a rock song and more like desert skies. It was nice. Throughout the record, listeners, they encountered themes of spirituality without being religious, mortality without talking about death all the time. It's a pretty good record. One of the album's hidden gems is a song called "Heal It Up." And like much of their work, it explores emotional stuff without being corny or becoming hopeless. There's a quiet resilience that goes through the song. I like it. The album was good. It was pretty good. I have to go back and listen to it again. Commercially, again, because the landscape had changed, it kind of flopped. It did. Record companies were now searching for the next grunge sensation. The radio playlists had become increasingly competitive, and not being competitive for Concrete Blonde. And while they remained critically respected, they were no longer receiving the same level of industry support and attention they had. And that just feels like a betrayal to me. And I don't want to get into the record industry, but them, Lone Justice, there's others that, they build them up, and as soon as it doesn't work immediately, they just show them the door. That stinks. The group officially disbanded in the mid-1990s, but for fans, it was disappointing, but not really surprising. I mean, they'd It always felt like a band driven by inspiration rather than obligation. That's just how they were going to do it. But fortunately, that wasn't the end of the story, because as happens with many bands that we love, time has a way of kind of restoring perspective. Distance allows artists to appreciate what they had together, and fans never stop asking for more. We just don't. I don't want to see REM come back together. I just don't. That ship has sailed. But before long, reunions, they happen. They start taking shape, bringing Napolitano, Mankey, and the band back together for additional recordings and tours. Now, unlike some reunion acts that primarily are there to relive old hits, Concrete Blonde approached their return with genuine creative energy. Don't know how I feel about that, because I think if you reunite later on, everybody's just going to hear the old stuff. That's just what it means to reunite. And the cynical part of me thinks a lot of these reunions are because the bills are piling up. I'll just be honest. But while mainstream audiences, largely remember Joey, devoted fans had transformed Concrete Blonde into something much bigger than a one-hit wonder, and I thought they were anyways. Now, after the band stepped away in the mid-1990s, Johnette Napolitano continued exploring her, creativity outside of Concrete Blonde. She was never simply a singer just waiting for the next project. She was an artist in the truest sense of the word. Throughout her career, she explored songwriting, visual art, I didn't know this, but poetry, and other creative outlets. Her work has always reflected, a restless curiosity and a refusal to be confined to one identity. James Mankey, he also remained an important creative guy. His guitar style has always been a major part of their identity. He was never a guitarist who needed to dominate every song. Like I said, solos weren't real flashy unless it needed to be. Instead, his guitar playing, it created something deeper, and I really liked that. But that chemistry between the two was so special. Many bands have talented musicians. Far fewer have members who just feel like they have to be together. I think maybe the DBs with Peter Holsapple and Chris Stamey, although I thought the DBs' best work was without Chris Stamey, but those two together, it just works. And in the pre-internet era, if a band disappeared from radio, it could become difficult for younger listeners to discover them. But streaming has changed everything. Suddenly, a teenager or a 20-something who heard Joey could instantly explore Bloodletting and Walking in London or any of their albums. They could discover that Concrete Blonde was famous for more than just that one song. And again, chicks love Bloodletting. So once you get them into Joey, that's the drug that gets them in the door, In 2001, Concrete Blonde released Group Therapy, marking another chapter in the band's story. I've never listened to this. I don't know if it's any good or not. It's just good to see them still doing stuff, and that's fine. They never tried to pretend they were still the same band from the 1990s, but they'd embraced, I guess, who they'd become. But I really need to listen to that because I really like them. If Bloodletting had been released a few years later, during the peak of the alternative explosion, conversation around the band might have been very different. Imagine Joey arriving during the height of early 90s alternative movement, during the height, because it was, during the 90s. But, to say it came out while Alanis Morissette was big, or maybe the Cranberries, or I don't know. It might have been different. And maybe Joey wouldn't have been the song to lead him there. Maybe it would have been Caroline or something like that. But instead, they arrived just a bit too early. Just a bit too different. The music industry often rewards timing almost as much as talent. There's countless of examples of that. They just got caught up in there. But perhaps becoming a massive commercial act would have changed them. Maybe part of what makes Concrete Blonde so beloved is they never became a corporate version of themselves. They never watered down their stuff just to chase a trend, and they never abandoned the darkness of their songs. And that's a human quality that I like. When fans talk about their favorite Concrete Blonde songs, the list always almost goes beyond Joey. Of course, we talked about Tomorrow, Wendy, and God is a Bullet, which is great. Countless album tracks that never received mainstream attention. And that's the sign to me of a truly great band. Because if you buy an album and it's got two good songs, the two that you heard on the radio and the rest are just drivel, and I fight that sometimes because I think we tend to get a bias because we've heard it on the radio. We think it's better. That's not always the case, but it's often the case. Concrete Blonde was better than that. Their non-singles songs were just as good as the rest, basically. And for many of us, Concrete Blonde is not music that we just hear. It's something that we remember, that we get nostalgic about sometimes. I listen to Bloodletting at least all the way through every other year or so. It's not one of my favorites. I don't listen to a lot of full albums anymore, but that's one I do from time to time. I got to see them one time at Rockefeller's in Columbia, South Carolina, and I got to tell you, it was for the second album, Free, and I had seen Driving and Crying at Rockefeller's the week before for like $12. That was like the going rate for a show. Concrete Blonde came to town. It was $30. You know, I'm bagging groceries at this point. That's a lot of money for a high school kid at that time. But I paid, and I got to go see them, and they were pretty good. I'd love to have gone to see them either on the Bloodletting tour or post, because I think all those songs would have been amazing live. But that's my personal story. I was up close, got to see them. They were really good, and maybe that's why Concrete Blonde deserves to be remembered, because they were overpriced. No, I'm just kidding. They were not only the band behind Joey, they weren't an alternative rock band from Los Angeles, not only, but a group of musicians who created something honest and timeless. They weren't concrete, they weren't blonde, and I don't know. The story is Johnette Napolitano used to be blonde. Maybe she was always dark-haired every time I saw her. Anyways, that's all I got for you on Concrete Blonde. This one went a little longer than I thought it would, but I had a lot to say. Once again, thank you to everyone who checks our videos out. Check us out on Instagram, check us out on Facebook, check us out on our website. Yeah, we're working on all that. We're going to get there. Until next time, you guys, take care.